This is the 14th of 36 city tour. And each night, or every other night, one or the other, here we are again. And each time I have to ask, what am I doing here? What are you doing here? What business have we together? And I begin to realize that we have an extraordinary quality of business together. Because you and I both know something, or we wouldn't be here. I mean, you wouldn't come to hear somebody called Ram Dass just by chance. You must know something that must be similar to what I think I know for you to want to come to have it reinforced. And here you are sitting among a lot of people, all of whom in some individual way probably think they're crazy. See, because of the way they feel and think and see the universe. And here you are getting reinforcement. I'm not alone. Here we all are. It's a gathering of the mad. These are the last remnants of a failed experiment. Which astral storyline would you like? These are the people that have seen the way, and on them rests it all. That's a good one. I mean, we're always milking these mythic identities. You know, we buy one and then we take it seriously. And the horror is when you live out the myth and you win and it feels lousy. I mean, you put all that juice into it. Like there's a study that says that people that make $10,000, this is a study that was done about realizing one's dreams. People that make $15,000 say that if they had $50,000, they could realize their dreams. People that have $50,000 say that if they had $100,000, they could realize their dreams. Now put that with the other statistic. In answer to the question, have you realized your dream? 5% of the people making $15,000 said they had. Of the people making $100,000, 6% said they had. Is it worth it? You and I come together as a quality of family, a family that shares some appreciation of something. Let's start general. For me personally, this all unfolded or unraveled in the 60s. In the 60s, I suddenly realized that I wasn't who I thought I was. Because I, like everyone else that I knew, had gone into somebody training when they got born, because their parents thought they were somebody, so of course they trained you to be somebody. And we were all busy being somebody. You somebody, I'm somebody. Hi, who are you? I'm somebody, okay, you know. And then who was more somebody than somebody else? And that was more somebody-ness. Okay? Okay. And I woke up in the 60s and I thought, wow, have I been had? Because this is only a creation of mind. I'm in a prison of a structure, a kind of a paradigm or a mythic structure of reality that everybody says, this is real. My father says, come down to reality, my boy. But even my boyness is only relatively real. Not only is that only relatively, but his sense of reality is only relatively real. In fact, that he exists at all is only relatively real. And that scares you. To realize that what you thought was real turns out to be only relatively real. And that you and I are meeting as a speck of foam on an ocean wave, or a star at dawn. Well, most of us, once we see, we began, what happens first, I think, if you're like me, is you start to get uneasy in your somebodyness. It feels a little claustrophobic. Everybody, see, we enter into these conspiracies with everybody. I'll make believe you are who you think you are, if you will make believe I am who I think I am. Okay. And we don't shake the ship. It's not very alive, but it's safe. But it feels a little constrained because you are and I am so much more than anything we could think we are. So you begin to feel uneasy. So you realize, Gurdjieff, the Russian philosopher, said an interesting thing. He said, if you would escape from prison, the first thing you must realize is you're in prison. If you think you're free, no escape is possible. It's a far-out image. So something happened to me, and it was induced via psychedelics, and therefore I obviously must honor psychedelics in a time when no is in vogue. So I do it. I say no, 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 no. And when I bring it into my mind, I spell it K-N-O-W. No, no. So when you start to realize you aren't who you thought you were because you are able to override the powerful habits of mind that everybody has agreed to as reality. I mean, I was watching a press conference this morning between Bush and the press. And they all were in this incredible conspiracy to define reality a certain way. And within that, they were all very reasonable, except it was totally psychotic. Well, when you first feel a little cramped by who you think you are, you go to a therapist because crampedness is usually neurotic. So I feel cramped. And the therapist helps you rearrange the furniture in the prison cell. Because the therapist thinks she or he is a therapist. I mean, how can you expect somebody to help somebody else escape? Only nobody can help somebody escape. But the likelihood of a therapist being nobody, well, the really good ones are playing with it. Because when you realize you've been had, you go into nobody training. See, that's why we're meeting. We are in nobody training. And then you become nobody being somebody, which is different than being somebody, see? Because the first somebody you really think you are, the next one you don't. As Don Juan said in the Castaneda books, it's called controlled folly. You huff and you puff and you make believe it matters. That's scary, isn't it? Now, wait a minute, it matters. We'll wait. But if it doesn't matter, will I be compassionate? Won't matter. Matters to me. Huh. So then you go to the therapist, and then you realize finally that you're going to, first of all, what you do is, if you found a way to get out of the prison cell for like an afternoon in the sun, which you do through all kinds of methods. I mean, people do it through surfing, they do it through sex, they do it through drugs, they do it through eating, they do it through joining groups, prayer, meditation. They transcend. There's a they go high, they get high. And what I did was I decided I wanted to really get high, because what this all was just so, I mean, I had been so stuck in this and in such suffering that to come up out of it was so wonderful, that out of it was wonderful and it stunk. So I became a renunciate. Like, get away from me. I will have no commerce with you. I'm going to a cave, be with God. But see, you're an existing karmic entity. You come with some stuff. And all I ended up, I ended up a horny celibate. That's what I ended up. It's like, not smoking. I haven't smoked in 2 years, 2 months, 4 hours, and 32 minutes. It's the kind of people that die of not smoking. And then I had this spook friend, Emmanuel. Emmanuel is a being that doesn't have a body. Now, some of you are, well, I don't know about that. But I don't see why you should be prejudiced. I mean, so you get over prejudice against color and age and all that stuff, and you really think you're pretty liberal. What if you don't have a body at all? Well, I don't know about that. Well, you sound like Jesse Helms. I mean, we're here. We bodiless people are here. You're gonna have to let us in sooner or later. Oh dear. Can God people be political, do you think? So Emmanuel, my friend, who speaks through this woman named Pat Rodegast, she channels Pat, Emmanuel, and Emmanuel is very charming and delightful, and it's fun having a friend that doesn't have a body. Because, they can tell you groovy things, they know things you don't know. Not necessarily, of course. I mean, you gotta realize that everybody that doesn't have a body isn't wise. I mean, a really jerk can die and then send back messages and like, be a jerk, and so, buy Lincoln Savings stock, So you've got to trust your intuitive heart as to whether it's a useful friend, just like you do on this plane. So, but Emmanuel is a delight. I like when I said, Emmanuel, what do I tell people about dying, since I work with dying? He gave me the best one-liner I have ever heard on earth, which is a lot to say. He said, Ram Dass, tell them that death is absolutely safe. And let that reverberate through you for a while. He said, it's like taking off a tight shoe. So when I said to Emmanuel, what am I doing here on earth? Who made this mistake? I mean, I'm much too high to be here. This is like, Everybody's got either greed, hatred, ill will, sloth and torpor, agitation, or doubt. It's called the 5 hindrances. Those are your entry credentials. And he said a wonderful thing. He said, Ram Dass, you're in school. Why don't you try taking the curriculum? Why don't you try being human? See, I had never thought of that because I was trying to get high. And human wasn't high. But then I realized that I wanted to be free, not high. And that free meant you couldn't stand anywhere, which meant you had to stand everywhere, which meant you had to be as much human as not human. Which is what Christ meant about in the world, but not of the world. So then I did an about face, and I started to absolutely delight in my humanity. Because I realized suddenly that my incarnation wasn't an error. That where you are at this moment is exactly right. There's no errors. But you're saying to yourself, well, except for that, if only I had. Watch it. Just for a moment, allow the fact that there are no errors. That it's just happening lawfully, in the way of things, in the Tao. And you're part of it. Just the way you are, with your parents, all your neuroses, everything. In all the years, are you here, by the way? Is everything all right? I can't tell. Yeah, okay. In all the years, I've been, a psychologist, a professor, used drugs, had a guru, did meditation, did spiritual practices, grew old. In all those years, I never got rid of one neurosis. I mean, not one, you'd think. Not one. That's far out. I mean, because I went through psychoanalysis and everything. What changed, however, was interesting. Because the neuroses used to be these huge monsters that would come in and they'd take me over. And I'd be smiling and then they'd come, and I'd turn into a this or a that. I'd become a first chakra ripping or a second chakra, I want it, And I watched myself turn into these things. And now, all my neuroses are like these little schmoos. And it's high sexual perversion. Haven't seen you in weeks. Come on in, have tea. Instead of, oh my God, sexual perversion. Now they're my style. As your faith in relative reality gets stronger and you realize you're not who you thought you were, then you can be more fully that because you're less feeling trapped by it. You're what's called in the dance of life, or the play, or the lila, or whatever that quality is, in the harmony, in the balancing harmony of it all. Now, there are certain imbalances that you and I are rectifying at this point. One of them is very profound, and it's very relevant at this moment in history, in external history. What seems to have happened is that when we became separate and went into separateness training, which is maybe the Garden of Eden or wherever you want to go for that, the instrument for that separateness, it's like you go into a spacesuit, you take incarnation, you go into a spacesuit, and there's a computer control mechanism. We call it the thinking mind. We think it's an isomorph with the brain, but it may or may not be. And the thinking mind thinks about objects. It's within the separateness thinking about everything else. Because you think about things. So there's always, the thinking mind is always one thought away from where the action is. Because it's always thinking about it. I mean, if you sneak up on your mind, you'll see that's what it's doing. Now, there is a whole other, the thinking mind processes, auditory, visual, kinesthetic, olfactory, smell, taste, all of it. And it gives you a map of how things are, which is ego and phenomenal extensions of that. The predicament is that's not all you are. And the rest of what you are isn't within that model. It's not within that conceptual structure. Because the other part of you is a part that's connected to the rest of the universe. You're part of systems, you're part of energy, you're part of changes, you're part of electrical potential, you're part of families and nation states and communities and ecosystems and sexual identities and species and members of groups of species and part of the cosmology and all of it. And at the deepest level, you are part of the one. There is only one, and you're it. So you can see you exist in an awful lot more ways than you think you do when you're in your thinking mind about who you are, no matter how grandiose it is. See, the thought, I am God, is not the same as being God. It's just a thought. The predicament is that the doorway to that part of us that is unitive, that is connected, that understands we are part of Earth's, Gaia's environment, all those levels of reality. The part in which that's natural for us, where we don't have to learn something new, is a part that we only know through something around the heart space. It isn't the romantic, emotional, poetic heart for the most part, although that's a doorway into it. It's more what it's in the center, and it's more what the Chinese call the sin, the heart mind. It's the wisdom seat. It's called the Atman in Hinduism, the Buddha mind, a Christ consciousness. The still small voice within. It's the love of Allah inside. That part of us, which the intuitive heart or mind, we have, it has a problem all by itself in that it doesn't really have much to do with our separateness. So it treats our separateness rather shabbily, especially from our separateness's point of view, as you might imagine. Because the heart, I mean, take even the emotional heart. When you fall in love with somebody, what do you say? What can I do for you? Just tell me what I can do for you. I mean, you want my car? You want my house? You want my life? What do you want? Here. The heart, my heart goes out to you. The heart knows no boundaries. I had a far-out experience last year. I was teaching a course at St. John the Divine in New York. It's a beautiful place, very powerful space. And I was teaching it co-sponsored by the Seva Foundation and St. John the Divine, Open Center, and WBAI. And there were about 200, 250, something like that, people like us. And all of us in the course, it was a 7-meeting course, we had to go out and participate, volunteer into either a homeless shelter or a homeless or soup kitchen or some political action around housing, something like that. And then we had to keep a diary, and then we had an open mic to discuss what we were learning. One woman said, I joined was in a shelter, but that's not what's in my diary. I want to share with you that every day for the past year, I've gone out of my apartment and I've gone to the bus Zen store, and at the corner, most days, there is this man begging. And she said, I give him a quarter sometimes, and sometimes I don't. She says, when I think about it, I realize I sort of have a budget in my mind. You know, I gave him the 3 quarters already, 2 days ago. Probably it's maybe $2.50 a week. But I've been doing this for a year. She said, but as a result of this course, I began to examine, and I realized that I had never acknowledged his existence. She said, I started to look at why I hadn't, and I realized that I was afraid. She said, so I asked myself, what are you afraid of? And she said, I wasn't afraid he was going to rape me, and I wasn't afraid he was going to steal my pocketbook. After all, we'd known each other for a year. No, she said, I was afraid he'd end up living with me. That if I opened my heart to him, where would be the boundaries? I mean, once you say somebody's family, your family, stay on the corner, I'll give you $2.50 a week. Okay? And every time the heart goes out, wants to give away too much, the mind says, now wait a minute. The lilies in the field stuff's great, theoretically. But you got health insurance. It's interesting that we end up feeling a tension between our mind and our heart, at the deepest part of our heart. And that tension is where the mind sees the heart as its enemy because it will destroy it. It's like Trungpa Rinpoche saying, enlightenment is the ego's ultimate disappointment. So beware. Only somebody heard that. Wavy Gravy, who's a very wise member of the board of the Seva Foundation, he's a clown and he's an extraordinary wise man. He ran, in the last 2 elections, he ran nobody for president. And there were, these great campaign slogans like, nobody can solve our economic problems. The best one was, nobody cares. Nobody makes apple pie like mother used to make. It goes on and on and on and on. And he pointed out that nobody got more votes than all the other candidates put together. So there's this tension, and what happens is we we veil our hearts with our mind. And we become, like if we're working in emergency rooms or ICU units or something like that, we often become what's called professionally warm. Oh dear. You know, and we're feeling it, but we're not opening our hearts, because if we open our hearts, it's gonna hurt. And we gotta save something for when we go home, we think. The other part of this, intuitive heart, which is this connection to our unity, is the word intuitive. And, you know, cultures change very fast. We're living in a new moment, because 20, 25 years ago, the word intuition was, we were so much in our intellects that the word intuition was like blasphemy. It was like a intuition. You know, the thing was to be rational, because the rational mind, that was science, and science created technology, and technology created progress, and progress, who knew what that would create? Maybe even happiness. It didn't, but we thought it would. And all of that was being created to ward off the fear of death, because somebody dies. Because who you think you are will die. Turns out who you also are doesn't, because it was never born. But who you think you are dies again and again and again. As Tim Leary said, I die so hard each time. The predicament for us is that when we veil the heart with the mind, we cut off our own source, which is a quality of intuitive wisdom. And not only did the rationalists, I mean, back in the old days, before women finally demanded that they be acknowledged to exist, the mind was very sexist. And so they would say, they'd sneer at intuition. I was at Harvard, so I know I could hear the sneer. I can still hear it in my mind, you know, intuition. Women intuit. Men think. See, that's the problem, turns out. Turns out that just what we need now, and we realize it suddenly, women had, but who'd listen to them? It's exactly like what happened with the Native Americans. I mean, we attempted total genocide. We didn't quite succeed, because they were primitive, you know, simple-minded people, and we just knew much better. But it turns out they knew what we now desperately need to know. And they may or may not say, screw you, you know, or they may be willing to guide us, who knows? Those that we haven't driven into alcoholism by our lack of respect of their traditions, which understood that they were part of systems. Everybody is experiencing the intuitive heart and information all the time, but the power of the mind gets so strong about what reality is that the mind does, the perception does a denial mechanism process where you don't even see this other stuff. And if you do, you decide it's irrelevant. I was out of my mind. I don't know what I was, We call it error variance in science. The fact that it's 80%, of the variability, well, we'll improve our tools yet. That's an in-joke for people in science. Like, for example, here's a statistic. In the past 20 years, there has been an increase, a continuous increase in polls showing in the number of widows who report having conversations with their dead husbands. Now, in reflecting about that, I was wondering, 20 years ago, was it the fact that dead husbands didn't talk to their wives? There were two other choices. One is they didn't talk to them. The second is the women didn't listen. And the third is they listened but didn't admit it because they'd be thought crazy. I think it's unlikely that husbands weren't talking to their wives. So I assume it's one of the latter two, and probably a combination of both of them. And the fact that now they can cop to it, I remember once living in a small town in New England, and there was a big mill in the town, and it was the thing of the town, and there was a manager of the mill who was the thing of the mill of the town. And I came back from India, and I was a real mashugana, I was like a beard and a dress and, long hair and beads, and lived in washed in cold water and cooked my own food. I was really out there. And I was holding on to my high is what I was doing. And one day, the wife of this man came to see me. It was far out. She came with suede gloves on, little white gloves, and everything perfect. And she drove up in a black, shiny Chrysler. And she came in to see this nut, And she said, there's nobody really I can talk to about what's been happening to me. She said, for the past 10 years, I've had this astral lover. And every time my husband leaves for work, this astral lover arrives. And we're together all day. And then he goes, and my husband comes home. And she said, I've never told anybody this. You can see why, can't you? I remember the rabbi that, when there was the unveiling of my mother's tombstone, I had just gotten back from India. And my father was on the board of the temple, which was a very prestigious temple in Boston. And so the rabbi was there, and he was in his soft hat and sunglasses out at the cemetery. And you take a cloth off the something, and I was the son, so one of the sons, so I was helping to do that. And there I was in my dress and beads and beard and all that. And the rabbi had never seen me. He assumed I was a relative, but he... and I was the son of a board member, so he came over afterwards and he grabbed me by the elbow. And he said, "What have you been up to?" So I said, "You want to know?" And he said, "Yeah." So we leaned against two tombstones, And I told him about India, and I told him about Maharaji, my guru, and I told him about different things that had happened that were really very out there, sort of what we call miraculous in the mind. And he listened with rapt attention, and he says, you know, he said, when I was studying at the seminary for my exams, I took a little too much no-dose. And at one point, the Bible I was studying fell away, and there I was on the plains, and I was there in the middle of it all with Moses, and his eyes lit up, and he became radiant, you know. I said, what grace. I said, you must have fed so many of the congregation by sharing with them this experience. He said, until this moment, I've never told anybody. He said, Judaism it has no relevance. He said, Judaism is a folk religion, and I'm an interpreter of the law. And I remember feeling so sad for him, so sad, that something that was so profound to him, he had to relegate into irrelevance because of the role he defined that was his role. And what happened to the role of the tzaddik, or the wise rabbi who was connected to the intuitive wisdom? We've done a very interesting thing in this society. I was reading a book by Robert Bella the other day and his associates. Because there were two kinds of institutions that could feed us and bring us back into the balance between the intuitive wisdom and the mind. The two institutions were the Republic and the church, religion. But the power of our economic models of reality were so powerful that they, in effect, emasculated both of those institutions in their capacity to bring us back into the intuitive heart. Like in Middle Eastern Europe, the Jewish rabbi was the head of the community and was revered, and the older, the wiser, and reverence for age. In the temples now, the board of trustees hires the rabbi, and they bargain with him about his salary, and he is their employee. Now the power structure shifted, as you can see. And who are the board of trustees? They're the richest people. For the most part, there's usually a token poor one, but so economics in that sense rules the church. How can a rabbi be wise? He may lose his job. It's interesting in the Republic that in the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the creating of the Constitution, roughly 50 of the 55 people involved in those different documents, roughly that same ratio, 50 of 55 were Freemasons. And the Freemasons were at that time not like just a fraternal symbolic organization. They were a practice of living truth in which they understood that the meaning of this plane only works when you have the deeper context, which comes through the intuitive wisdom, so that you acknowledge the bigger context in which this exists. And for example, on the dollar bill, that pyramid that's broken in the middle with the upper part with the eye in it, that's not just, hocus pocus stuff. That's saying that the structure only becomes whole when the connection to the one is put together with the base. And then when that space diminishes, then it's one thing. The same thing to the leaders as we did to the rabbis. We've turned them into economic entities. And so we've cut ourselves off. the two institutions that could have reminded us of that place that you and I are connected to all things, which is exactly what we are at this point about to need very much as our myths change. These institutions, see, the predicament is there are the maps of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but in order to read the map, you have to acknowledge this other part of reality, so that you got maps, but nobody can read them. The people that read them to give political speeches, and they can't understand them. The Supreme Court hardly seems like a group of people that meditate. They are the high priests of the temple of the mind. And the mind can't understand the Constitution without the heart. The fear that woman in New York felt was that if she went into her heart, she would lose her boundaries. The boundaries are those that are created by the mind. But when you truly listen to the harmonies of things, you see that you and I are both separate and we are not separate. And that the mind is a beautiful instrument for discriminative wisdom that helps us, discriminative knowledge that helps us maintain our separateness and express its uniqueness. At the same moment, our heart is our connection. It's our feeding way into the universe. We're then connected with all things. We then have the energy of all things. It's all part of the same thing. And we are like trees or rivers or, trees don't burn out like I'm tired of being a tree. Jesus, what a drag. Holy God, this must end sometime, And the horror of being afraid of your own heart, and yet unless your heart is acknowledged in part of the balance between the mind and the heart, if you don't come back into that balance and the heart isn't open, there's no feeding. Just like when you're in love, you get fed. There's a feeding going on. And all the tiredness and tightness and closeness and alienation and all that stuff, now, the interesting time we are in is a time in which there is very rapid change on the plane where people who think they are real live. That reality. There's a lot of change going down. I mean, there's change politically. Really far out changes. And they may be extraordinary changes because what's happened in Tiananmen Square and then in Eastern Europe and in Africa and hopefully in China and Central America maybe soon, Tibet, was the awakening of some quality of human spirit that got in touch with its intuitive wisdom and truth deeply enough to say, and felt strong enough to question the reality of the social institutions under which it had been living. And suddenly, like a house of cards, they all started to do this thing. Like the Berlin Wall. I grew up with the Berlin Wall. I mean, for 40 years we've been dealing with the emperor's new clothes. That's been a reality. And suddenly, in all the people-to-people bridge links, it turns out that over there are other people just like us. You here, I'm here to say, this is a real mess, isn't it? Yeah, right. Boy, our leaders have really taken us for a ride, haven't they? But they're us, so that's the problem. Our fear took us for a ride. Because the mind is always busy being the representative of our somebodyness, which is very tiny in such a big universe. Always feels vulnerable and frightened. Death's at one end and chaos is everywhere around. So you keep trying to structure things like the handkerchiefs go in that drawer, you know, and I know how it is. And there's good and there's evil and there's right, and you da, 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 da. And then we'll stay that way. But it's tricky because everything's changing. I mean, in the nature of things, they change. So when you invest in not change, it must be difficult. I mean, that is a bad investment. You know, things will never change around here. Those are usually in grade B movies. Somebody says that, just as the bulldozer drives down the street. And the people that are opposing change or are frightened by change, they're not bad people. They, in their minds, are doing, their fear of chaos is immense. I mean, it's interesting, like Madame Ceausescu, just as they were about to shoot her, said something like, "My children, why are you doing this to me?" I mean, in this paternalistic, maternalistic you know. I'm sure the king and queen of Nepal are roughly saying the same thing. Hey, kids, what are you doing? We've been taking care of you. It's okay. So politically, I mean, there are whole new kinds of role models appearing. The Dalai Lama, there's a political figure. People say to him, "Aren't you angry about the Chinese?" He says, "No, that wouldn't be functional." I mean, that's an interesting politician. I mean, we have President Havel of Czechoslovakia, and he says to our Congress, unless we find a new way of human consciousness, nothing much is going to happen. That's pretty far out for a politician to say to our Congress, and they all wanted his autograph. And there's Nelson Mandela. I mean, it's great. There's a whole renaissance of beings who are in some way connected to that deeper place and are speaking from there, like Gandhi was, or people like that. I think Lincoln was, in part. So what those Eastern European countries are doing is they are mirroring for us, because they have lived under repression for so long that they are now experimenting with democracy. So they're looking and saying, what is democracy all about? And that is mirroring for us what we came to believe democracy was all about. And we have been the leaders of democracy in the world. Except that our democracy has to do with consumers. It's so economically linked. And our democracy is still living within a mythic structure that has very little humanness in it. I mean, it produces as its mythic result Donald Trump, for example. Now, Donald, I'm not talking about the human being in there. I'm just talking about that mythic role. That is an obscenity. It's a runaway system in which that is somebody that's a hero figure in the culture. And you and I know it isn't a hero figure in the culture. And yet we're still living in a culture in which it is. That's the interesting thing, the tension between the inner and the outer, between what you and I intuitively understand as we've acknowledged and given vent to our intuitive wisdom, which has to do with compassion and truth and love and merging and equality and fairness and justice and humility and emptiness and equanimity. I mean, the increasing polarity in economics, leave politics from economics, between the haves and the have-nots, it's getting staggering. How few people have and how many people have not. And they're not indefinitely going to wait around for the altruistic trickle-down effect. So there is hot breathing at the door, and the north-south debt structures and all of that. I remember being in Guatemala for the Seva Foundation. We work in the highlands with these Mayan Indians who are extraordinarily beautiful human beings. And they are people who, the women have watched their husbands and sons be murdered by the army, which is in the employ of the rich people who control the government, that of course our government backs, which is like about 4% of the population that has about 85% of the land. So the women have watched these people come in and murder their men folk for attempting to get their lives together. They're waiting for the rich people to come in and murder them. And I flew from there to Hollywood, where I had some business. And I found myself in Brentwood, which is a very posh community near Beverly Hills. And I drove down a street, and there on this street were all these huge houses, multi-million-dollar houses, each with big walls, with big iron gates that electrically open and close with monitors and just going. And in front of each one was a little red sign put there by the security agency. And it said on it, "Armed Response." I thought, isn't that far out? I just came from a country where the poor people are frightened, sitting, waiting for the rich people to murder them. Isn't that far out? Certainly seems so to me. See, the predicament you and I face as individuals is we thought, I want to be happy. And happiness has to do with a certain style of life. And I've got the style of life, and now I want to be happy. But there are a lot of people who don't have that and who aren't happy by those criteria. So the only way I can be happy, really, is to sort of not think about them. But you find out it's just like the woman with the man standing at the corner begging, that if you turn off something in order to be happy, your happiness is extremely unstable because it's based on denial. And not only that, but it means you have to close down your heart to be happy. It's like there is so much suffering in the world. Most people say, if I open to the suffering, I would just be in my heart would be breaking all the time. And the answer is, yes, it would. but you would have connected to the deeper part of your heart, that heart wisdom, that sin, that intuitive place that is the quality of love, not loving, it's the presence, it's quality of presence, and there would be a part of you that would be absolutely present and in the state of love, even as your emotional human heart was breaking again and again and again. And when they say that in India, for the saints, all people are their children, I mean, just imagine that at this, every day, 30 to 40,000 mothers in this earth watch their babies die of malnutrition. Are they them or are they us? Are they us or are they me? Where does your mind define the line in order for you not to be overwhelmed by the amount of suffering and to protect yourself and hold on to your stash? It's like, it's interesting because I used to misinterpret a Sufi statement, which is very far out. I used to mistranslate it as, trust in Allah, but tie your camel. See? And then I realized I was translating it wrong. The true statement is, trust in Allah and tie your camel. Very different. And it's in the harmony of the way of things. You stand nowhere and you're impeccable everywhere. You're living on each plane in its appropriate way. I was faced with this problem in teaching this course on homelessness because my dad had died earlier in the year, and I was with him, and it was beautiful, and he was 90, and it was all cool. And I dissolved the house, and then I didn't have to be in Boston, where I'd been basing myself to take care of my father for many years. So the group in the Seva Foundation decided we'd all live more closely together, and so there was a vote taken, and I ended up in California, in Marin, near San Francisco. And I ended up in a beautiful carriage house on a friend's piece of land, one of the other board members. And this carriage house I heard about, and then I went out and saw it. It was a beautiful carriage house in the woods, and it was just lovely. The only thing it was missing was a fireplace to make it an essence carriage house. And it was missing a hot tub because, now, see, in Chicago, that doesn't have the same poignancy as in Marin. Marin hot tubs are like toilets because they have water droughts and you can't use so much water, but this uses the same water, so at any rate, I needed those two things. And I found a hot tub wholesale for $3,200. So there I was in New York teaching this course on homelessness, which had some homeless people in it, by the way. And in the meantime, in preparation for when the course was over and I was moving to California, I was having this hot tub installed in Marin. The question was whether I would tell the people in the course. See? You see the problem. See how we have these categories in our heads? If they knew, I mean. So, of course, I told them. And they were great. I mean, they were wonderful. They took me off the hook immediately. They said, it's very therapeutic. I let them have that. I work with AIDS, people with AIDS. I work with them as they're approaching, those that have become very symptomatic and they're approaching leaving their bodies. That's the time I work with them. fact, I was just at a hospice in Boston that I spent years preparing, helping to get ready, and it's now functioning beautifully, and there are 18 people with AIDS. It's only for AIDS patients, and there are 18 there now, men and women, old and young, needle users and gays and everything. And their average length of stay there is, they're about 30 days, 35 days before they die. So it's incredible space. And when I sit down with such a being, I see my edge. I see the edge in this dialogue I'm talking about between the mind and the heart and so on. I wrote a book with Paul Gorman a couple of years ago called How Can I Help? It's very good. I mean, it deals with suffering and burnout and all that stuff. But it kind of got to the edge of this thing, and now I'm just really playing with it in my own life more deeply. Because when I sit down with such a person, the question is, who's there? I mean, who am I and who are they? And what does my mind do in relation to them, and what does my heart do in relation to them? I mean, I can be very kindly and good, and they can be a person with AIDS. That's one reality. I could be a soul, and they could be a soul, and we've both taken incarnation trying to figure out what the hell is going on here. You've got quite a trip, haven't you? Yeah, I'm dying of AIDS. Wow, must be interesting. Or we can go beyond our separateness, and there's just presence. In which case, the whole drama dissolved back into the akash, into the emptiness, and here we are. I realized that anything short of falling in love with each and every one of them was cheating both of us, falling into love with them. Not in the romantic sense, but not in the romantic sense. But if I were to do that, it means that my heart is going to break, because then I'm going to get attached to them and not want them to die. And then when they die, it's going to hurt, and I'm going to have grief. And I don't want to hurt, and I don't want to have grief. So I do that thing. I get just so close. But then neither of us are healed by the interaction. And the real interaction occurs when I just become a conduit, and we just kind of feed one another through our beings. Now, the reason I love doing that kind of work is because these people with AIDS are facing a breakdown of such monumental proportions of their models of reality. Many of them have been socially ostracized. Their dreams have crashed. Their models of how old you live to be are gone. Their beauty, their attachment to their physical beauty is falling apart with KS and all those kinds of things. And they're dying. And they can't any longer stand up or move. And their illness is opportunistic. So just as they get comfortable with one set of symptoms, a new one hits them from somewhere else. And at first they take will, and I'm getting better, and I'm taking these vitamins, and this is going to help, and this and that. And then after a while, their will starts to weaken when they keep getting hit all the time. These are those specific ones that are following this course. I mean, there are other people with HIV positive that are not having these kinds of symptoms at all. That's another thing they're facing. It's interesting that those conditions, which from your somebodyness are the ultimate in horror, are, from the spiritual point of view, the absolute optimum conditions for awakening. Because it's just when none of it works that the ego says, ugh. And as it gives up, it's like there's a crack in the egg. And if there is an environment for that person at that moment that allows them to come up for air, to be in the presence of a consciousness that doesn't say you're somebody with AIDS dying, but just is here, that's a moment. It's like a moment of opportunity when a person, their whole life can have a whole new meaning at that point. Remember a nurse dying and she said, I know I'm dying of cancer, but look at the beauty of the universe. It was just like a perspective shift. She opened to the context in which the act existed. So my work with that person, first of all, when I am with somebody that is dying, truth really reigns, because anything else seems so patently hollow. I mean, the person's usually surrounded with people that are hysterically frightened of death, and so they're lying through their teeth. You're looking better. The new treatment's really going to work. And then you meet the person in this simplicity and this truth and this compassion for their pain and their suffering, in which you're both sharing the compassion. Just like I feel about my own life, how poignant I am. Beautifully poignant. The horrible beauty of nature. My edge is that I have to fall into love and realize my heart is going to break and I am going to grieve, and do it again and again and again, and rest in the part of me that sees that the universe is as it is and there are no errors in it. My guru used to say to me, Ram Dass, don't you see it's all perfect? And I go into my mind and say, perfect? My judging mind. What about Bangladesh? What about Africa? What about... Yes, Ram Dass, but don't you see it's perfect? I couldn't get back far enough to see it. And then once you do get back far enough to see it, you can't stay there. Because if you do, you lose your connection to it all. You're not in your human form, and that's what we are. We're halfway between all these places to give ourselves to be in truth. So you're standing where it's all perfect and somebody falls down and you say, karma. Okay. But if you're just in your human heart and they fall, oh my God, you fell, oh, and then it's, and your heart's breaking and finally you can't stand it anymore. You burn out and you get cold or cynical or you phony or something. You go into your mind, you do something to protect your heart because you can't stand it anymore. And you get cold and whatever happens under those things and alienated and all that stuff. The balance is what's interesting. The living with the paradox that it's perfect and it stinks. That it is beautiful. It is the unfolding of the formless into the form. It is all precious and graceful. And for us to be able to even see it is like what Rilke talks about as seeing beyond the billboard at the edge of town. It's like you see behind the veil of it all. And at the same moment, your human heart hurts like hell because of the suffering, and as a human, you do what you can to relieve the suffering, even though at the other place you understand that suffering is grace. And those are the paradoxes you live with. That's what you and I are learning to live with. And that's the way you finally keep your heart open in hell. And you embrace the suffering into yourself, and therein lies real joy. The joy is being part of this immense process of formless and form and change and decay and growth and birth and death. If you think the political and economic things are creating changing conditions in life, try ecology. Woo. We are having a rude awakening to the fact that that the technology in which we put so much faith is drowning us with its excretia. And we don't know what to do with it because we didn't make a plan. Because who thought you couldn't just use it all up indefinitely? Keep the GNP going up. I mean, poor little minds, you've got to expect a problem. I mean, the political structure is like 2 to 6 years long. You know, take nuclear waste, that's a good one. I mean, nuclear waste has a toxic life of 250,000 years. We don't know what to do with it. Well, we'll dig a hole in salt in New Mexico, and we'll put it in there. And the salt will close down, and the barrels are double barrels, and it'll all be safe for 250,000 years. How do you know? Well, we've researched. For 250,000 years. I mean, that's 100 times longer than recorded history. No, but we have a theory. Aha. How interesting. And as the stuff hit the fan about the nuclear waste, 2 miles square hole in the ground in southern New Mexico, a memo comes out describing southern New Mexico, because it's poor and all, as what's called a sacrifice zone. That didn't sit too well with the New Mexicans. We're facing a situation where we are polluting at such a rate and using up our resources at such a rate that we have taken billions of years of something and in a couple of 100 years just completely done it in, almost. And it's going to mean, if it's to change, a basic change in our lifestyle and our myths. So that there you've got political, economic, ecological, and I haven't even dealt with social and moral. You've got changes everywhere. And how do people respond to change? People who are busy being somebody and identifying with what they've got are going to get frightened. And when they get frightened, they get very difficult. They get judgmental, they get repressive, they even get violent. And when they push against the change, and the change is so powerful that it inevitably has to happen, it forces the revolutionary process, that one thing has to overthrow the other for it to happen. But change doesn't have to happen through revolution, it can happen through evolution as well. It can happen because enough people, or some people, or whatever it is, whether it's the 100th monkey or whatever you want to call it, enough people dwell in another kind of reality so that one reality just kind of flows into the next one, and suddenly we are living in a new reality. I mean, it has happened dramatically in the last 30 years. Like 30 years ago, I would tell a story about something that had happened to me under 1,000 micrograms of acid. And I tell it to the club of people who'd either tripped or had been to India or, read holy books or Alan Watts or something. And we'd be a club, and everybody would understand, yeah, right, wow, far out. Now, I can speak to any lecture hall of people, I'd say 70% of them never took grass, never went to India, never read holy books like that. And I can tell the same story and they all go like this. Now, how do they know? It's interesting to watch a shift in consciousness creep into a culture. Now, you can look at that positively or negatively. Last week was Earth Day, and I felt I should make a contribution to Earth Day in some way. So I got this image, which was a fact that I thought I would contribute to Earth Day consciousness. The fact is that when you take a frog and drop it into boiling water, it will jump out. That's only half the fact. The other half of the fact is that if you put the frog in cold water and heat it up, it will boil to death. Now, you can look at this either way. As you adjust to the pollution, say, well, that's life. It's too bad all the tuna was poisoned, but, well, I used to love those trees, but the cement is nice. And, as you kind of keep adjusting to it, it's only a styrofoam cup. What the hell? It's not going to be and I got to get to work. And as you keep adjusting to the quality of life going down and down and down, as the good life is sold more and more and more, which separates the rich from the poor, That's one way of understanding the frog story. The other way is that the evolutionary changes are happening and nobody's even noticing. And that the thing is so gentle, and there are Dalai Lamas, and there are Havels, and there are Nelson Mandelas, and there are people like Mother Teresa, and there are wisdom beings that emerge in which the whole process goes softly, it goes gently, it goes lovingly. It is not ruled by fear, it's ruled by love. It's ruled by compassion. It's ruled by caring. It's ruled by the compassion that arises out of an identification with all of it. It comes out of the wisdom that you and I have been working to cultivate and acknowledging in ourselves all these years. It puts you and I in an interesting role in the dance. Because of all the people who are afraid of change, perhaps we are a little less afraid of change than other people. And as Gandhi said, when somebody said, give us a message, he said, my life is my message. And you and I, as we acknowledge our life is our message, and we acknowledge the intuitive doorway that gives us a wisdom that understands about truth and compassion and the heart and the balances, and that it doesn't have to be the way it is. And you feel how long you've been a closet compassioner, how long you've lived in an alien environment. It became interesting what forces work. Like President Reagan's 8 years were so lacking in compassion. Not among all the people, but the mythic structure of it was that it offended us. Didn't it? I mean, it was offensive to the human heart. It was an offense. And it caused the pendulum to swing. And so now there's another moment. It's an incredible moment. My phrase these days is, because if you like those kind of mobile, those volatile, exciting moments between cosmos and chaos, like riding waves in the ocean, my expression is, if you like the 60s, you're going to love the 90s. Because it's here we go. Now, what are the things that allow us to change? I mean, who you think you are and who you are to become, to be part of a bioregion, to be part of a global consciousness, to be part of a system, to understand your unique part in it, which is the balance between your mind and your heart, and you're listening to hear what boundaries your karma demands, and flowing within all that, keeping your heart open in hell, and becoming an instrument of compassion and emptiness at the same moment. That's what it's about. And in this kind of volatile period of change, that dissonance between the inner and the outer, there is a new moment when we hear resonance from outside, like Eastern Europe, like Tiananmen Square, like South Africa, like where the dignity, the concepts of democracy or of human potential realization, whatever that quality is, about honoring species, honoring systems, being part of systems, all of that has another opportunity to play. It can come out a little bit. And we start to make the inside like the outside. Now, one of the ways those changes go from who you thought you were to who you're to become are through rites of passage or rituals. In many tribes, when you want somebody to change that way, you pull them out of the context, keep them out for a period of time, do a retraining, like they take a young male in the tribe who would have been with his mother for the first 7 years, and then the men would come and take the kid and pull him from his mother and go off to the woods for a year. And then he'd come back and he would be an adult male of the tribe. We don't have so many of those for what we are about, what you and I are about. That's why our coming together in networking and recognizing each other is very critical. I mean, think of how common the dis-ease was for how many years in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, etc. before this didn't come out of nothing. Think of how many people in Germany were in pain about what was happening to the Jews and the Poles, and yet you couldn't acknowledge it. The next thing that changes people is trauma. Believe me, when it gets bad enough, things change. I mean, at that level, what we're looking at is we're all busy reshuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic. Suzuki Roshi said in relation to that, he said, life is like setting sail aboard a boat that is about to go out into the ocean and sink. That's irrelevant to this discussion. It was just a nice line.